A spectre is haunting Europe. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. This is the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. The spectre that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were talking about was communism, and it was in 1848. Today, another spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre is urban sprawl, and all the established forces are against it. The European Commission and the European Environment Agency, famous respected researchers and authors like Peter Hall and Michael Batty, and a cartel of red planners and green policymakers. I believe that Hubert and I belong to this group. This term was invented by Josias van Aartsen, a parliamentary leader of VVD, a Dutch conservative liberal party. The most famous party member nowadays is Geert Wilders. The party is not only against Islam, it's also in favor of, for example, building more houses and new roads in the countryside. During the 10-year period, 1990 to 2000, the growth of urban areas and associated infrastructure throughout Europe consumed more than 8,000 square kilometers, equivalent to the entire territory of the state of Luxembourg and nearly half of the territory of Slovenia, or 0.25% of the combined area of agriculture, forest and nature land. We are talking about an almost irreversible process concentrated to particular, often valuable and sensitive areas. Less than 10% goes the opposite way, from urban land into brownfields, and only a minor part of these are reclaimed to arable land and or nature. The origin of urban sprawl is the American dream. The term the American dream was first used by James Truslow Adams in his book The Epic of America, which was written in 1931. Some say that the American dream has become the pursuit of material prosperity, that people work more hours to get bigger cars, fancier houses, the fruits of prosperity of their families. Today we see the consequences of a dream that has become a nightmare. US former Vice President and Nobel Prize winner Al Gore says that if steps aren't taken to curb sprawl, urbanization will consume so much farmland that the United States may run out of enough agricultural land to feed itself in the 21st century, and for the first time in the nation's history become a net importer of food. Urban sprawl is the low-density expansion or leapfrog development of large urban areas into the surrounding rural land. In the European Commission document Towards a Strategy for the Urban Environment, urban sprawl is recognized as the most important of urban planning and design issues. An important driving force behind urban expansion is, of course, the growth of the urban population. But talking about Europe, this is not a sufficient explanation. Since the mid-1950s, European cities have expanded on average by 78%, whereas the population has grown by 33%. Even in regions where the population is decreasing, the red areas on the map, urban areas are still growing, notably in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and in Eastern Europe. This is illustrated by the map from two of, and that is maybe I should also have said in the beginning of and the presentation of myself that I'm coordinator of an ongoing project, EU project called PLUREL, dealing with urban-rural relationships. And here we see two of the PLUREL project's case study areas. And the yellow parts represent additional urban land from 1990 to year 2000. And it's no surprise, of course, that the Randstad region in the Netherlands, that we have a lot of yellow areas. That is an expanding area economically and also regarding population, and it's one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. But we can also see to the right that the Leipzig-Halle region in eastern Germany, that urban sprawl is existing despite a shrinking population. If you remember the last slide, Leipzig-Halle is in the red area here. And at the same time we can see this, the decline of areas or within the city center, a lot of empty spaces, at the same time as we have a suburban development going on in the urban fringe or the countryside. This is sometimes called the pineapple slice principle or donut development principle. How does then the future look like? This is what has happened during the past years. In the PLUREL project, we worked with 4 different so-called shock scenarios for future development, based on the global scenarios of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And the term shock scenarios, the term shock is, as you might be familiar with this economic crisis and these things, it's actually better to use when you are working with scenarios. It's not just predictions, but you say that this is something that really have an influence, a dramatic influence on future. It's more, from a pedagogical point of view, it's important to calculate also with rather radical changes in the future. The 4 different scenarios, 2 are, you can say, combined with strong economic growth, and then on the other axis we have 2 of them are oriented towards globalization, and 2 of them to more regional futures. The A1, so-called hypertech, describes a future world of rapid economic growth, the rapid spread of new technologies, and declining energy prices. A2, extreme water, describes a more heterogeneous world. Economic development is primarily regionally oriented, and per capita economic growth and technological change are more fragmented and slow. The peak oil, B1, describes a future of environmental and social consciousness, a global approach to sustainable development, and a dramatic increase in energy prices. And the last one, the fragmentation, B2, scenario describes a fragmentation of society in terms of age, ethnicity, and international distrust. With scenario A1, it is likely to see small polycentric towns to become even more popular, and it may lead to peri-urbanization and metropolitanization of rural areas. While in B1, most people attempt to return to larger towns and cities as high transport costs will limit commuting distances. In A2, huge sums of money are spent on defense and adaptation to climate change, and in B2, cities become more dispersed as younger migrants dominate city centers, while the older natives escape to the outskirts and enclaves outside the city. But as you can see, regardless which future scenario we choose, urban expansion will continue with 0.4 to 0.7% per year, which is more than 10 times higher than the development of any other land use in Europe. These figures are calculated from the Nemesis econometric model developed by the research laboratory Erasme in Paris, and it's the same macroeconomic model that Hubert was referring to and is used in the sensor project. Now I take a little step to the side and just a side comment to this, that this is not primarily, you can say, a European phenomenon or a European problem, because between 1995 and 2030, and this is according to figures from the World Resource Institute, 90% of the projected world population increase will be in urban areas in developing countries. Since last year, more than the half of the world's population live in cities and in towns, and in 2025, the same thing, more than 50% of the population is expected to live in urban areas also in Asia and Africa. And this means huge, okay, here you can see the how the part of the population in urban areas is increasing in the developing countries. This means huge challenges, of course. And here you have two examples. The one from Mexico City, to deal with it, they built a wall that they called the muro ecologico to stop settlements from developing into certain areas. To the right side, we have a picture from the township Alexandra in Johannesburg, where our institution has been cooperating with some South African NGO called Food and Trees for Africa. They are trying to deal with these townships and settlements in a way that we did in the beginning of the 20th centuries in the Scandinavian countries, for example. The strategy was to help people to get loans to build their own houses and so on. We helped them especially with something about gardening and tree planting and things like that. Okay, that was in brackets, but just to remind you that this problem of urbanization is a small one, actually, what I was describing, and regarding the situation in Europe. This is a huge challenge from a global point of view. So let's turn back to the European situation and the development that you have seen, and this so-called urban sprawl phenomena. What do you think, what are the main reasons? Why are this happening? And do you see any negative consequences in it? What do you think? Why? Why are urban areas growing? So
People get richer and they just want to have more space around them.
Different policies? Okay, yeah, might be. Yeah. Yeah. I think I would agree very much with you that the main driver behind actually urban sprawl is that it's, if you give people all chances to choose how to live, 90% of them want their own house with a garden and so on. I think that is a normal reaction. But what are then the negative consequences? Why don't we say that, okay, that's what people want to have it like that? Why don't we leave them? There is not land enough, yes?
Well, we have longer transportation ways for the people to work and for longer infrastructure routes if you want so.
Yes?
That's just a major causing problems.
Okay, traffic problems. Yes, you wanted to say something up there.
Yesterday, cities usually were found a very fertile soil. Usually.
Yeah.
So next to a river or to a coast, if we spread into those areas, we actually build on those really good
On the
soils. That's not a problem. Then you just like we have a problem in Mongolia.
yeah.
Like so, all those cities, this urban sprawl are around those really, really agricultural areas. Used to be.
Okay, yeah.
Everybody goes to the cities, we have a problem with.
Consumption of agricultural land, yes? Mm.
Just because of education and because no way the younger population want to work on the land.
Mm.
They just want to get better jobs.
Yeah.
So they can do more modern job than the rural.
That is both part of the explanation why urban sprawl is happening, as well as it's a problem with the drainage of villages of young people. Okay, let's see. Here is one list which has been produced in another EU project called Scatter, which are the usually admitted negative effects of urban sprawls. Consumption of land and loss of agriculture, land and open space was mentioned here. Destruction of biotopes and fragmentation of ecosystems. Higher cost of public services, especially transport. And increase of the use of private car and traffic congestions. Increase in fuel consumption and air pollution. Decay of downtown areas. Social segregation and reduction of social interaction, poor access to services for those with limited mobility. There are certainly more. Okay, yes?
The decay of downtown areas, is that, I mean,
It depends on where in Germany you are, I guess. I suppose you have some, Leipzig, for example, you can see a clear decay in the downtown area at the same time. In some of the, yeah, not the whole downtown Leipzig, but part of it. This is a popularly or very commonly used graph. It's made by Peter Newman, who is perhaps best known internationally for coining the term automobile dependence in the second half of the 80s to explain how the kind of cities we are building based on sprawling suburbs was inevitably leading to the growth in automobile use. And together with his colleague Jeff Kenworthy, Newman led an international research survey of transport practices and urban structures with original data on 32 global cities. The results showed that American cities are much more dispersed than European and Asian cities, and that their energy consumption for transportation is significantly higher. Newman's results has been supported also by some European studies with a recommendation to build more compact cities. And consequently, the EC, European Commission, thematic strategy on the urban environment recommends better coordination between urban transport and land use planning and more compact settlements. But combined with the trends like new urbanism and more sealed surfaces, like the neighbor to Karin and me in our hometown Hjärup in Sweden, a lot of sealed surface and a lack of green space is very vulnerable for the effects of climate change. For example, the increasing number of heavy rainstorms, in Denmark we call them monster rains, will cause even bigger problems with flooding if there are no areas left over for the water to infiltrate into. Therefore, when we are talking about adaptation to climate change in urban areas, this is an example from a UK project called ASKU, Adaptation Strategies to Climate Change in the Urban Environment. It shows the amount of green space and the infiltration capacity, and stresses the need for what you call buffer zones, which can help the sewer system to take care of these heavy rainstorms. Also, temperatures will change in the future, and the so-called urban heat island effect will strengthen the effects of climate change. The project results also show that green areas play an important role for smoothing the effects of rising temperatures. For the city of Manchester, an increase of green space with 10% in residential areas will compensate for even the worst case temperature scenario in 2080. If you look at, let me see, if you start to follow this one and go back to that. So the issue of urban density versus green space is an example of a potential conflict between mitigation and adaptation concerns. If increasing density in order to reduce energy by lowering travel, demand and heating requirements leads to the consumption of green space resources, its consequence will be the loss of a vital adaptation resource. So, in one way or the other, we have to try to find a balance between this. And now comes to, let me see, I'll check the order here. Okay. A discussion, how should we solve this problem? How to deal with a problem like this? Do you have any solutions or ideas? Yes? Mitigation is that you will, one reason for behind climate change is that you let out a lot of greenhouse gases. Mitigation means that means efforts to reduce the production of greenhouse gases. So you try to, mitigation means solving the problem, while adaptation means adapt to the problem. And we have to do both because we know that we can't stop, we can't turn things backwards. So there will, as we know, even with the most optimistic alternatives, there will be further climate change for a long period of time, and therefore we need to have strategies for dealing with this as well. Okay, then I go back because that is what, are you familiar with the word oxymoron? Yes? What does it mean? Yeah. An oxymoron is a popular word nowadays in some society, some parties where you are talking about multifunctional is one way that you combine different things. When oxymoron is the tougher challenge, that is to combine things which are contradictory. And that is why I would say that, and now you must forgive me because I'm using, I think Scandinavia is quite far on the way to dealing with this problem, so I will use Scandinavian examples. And the oxymoron that I is arguing for in this case is the compact green city, the combination of both a green city and a compact city. And we see some examples here on Scandinavian planning and building tradition that might function as good inspiration. The Danvik Cliff in Stockholm is an area from the 40s. The Fredensborg houses in Copenhagen or in Denmark is from the 60s. And the Tapiola, the district in the Finnish town Espoo, was largely constructed in the 50s. These are all examples of quite compact areas or compact building, but also with a green image. And how to reach this? You need to have strategies and so on, and I will discuss some, I think, important strategies behind an urban development that promotes such green compact cities. The first one is, and that is, I would say, the most important one, is to coordinate transport, land use, and open space planning. And what we see here, my colleagues tease me because I'm using a plan from 1947, actually, this finger plan from Copenhagen. But the idea behind the finger plan was that residential areas, as well as also, like in this case, working places, offices and things like that, should be developed along the transport corridor, which are represented by the fingers. So, and an important part, as I said, of this strategy is the near-to-station principle. meaning that new working places, if possible, should be located close to public transport. In between the fingers, open spaces are preserved as green wedges, forming an overall green infrastructure. Although the hand through the years has got some swimming web between the fingers, the original vision behind the finger plan is still the principle for future development of Greater Copenhagen. The second one I will mention here is preservation or sometimes development of a green infrastructure for walking and cycling. For example, to limit the number of cars on the roads, to make it as comfortable as possible for people to use the way to their work, also for exercise by walking and cycling. And it was mentioned yesterday, on Saturday, the excursion to the nature reserve outside Koper, which is a very good, interesting example of a near to city nature area. Here we have examples from Stockholm in Sweden and Hämeenlinna, which is a city in Finland. There in Sweden and Finland, they even have what they call national urban parks in order to preserve a larger system, a network of green areas. And it's also important when we are talking about biodiversity and corridors for wild plants and animals to spread into urban areas. It's also a question of design and creating new urban landscapes of which represents this compact green city or a compact garden city. You see here an example from Oslo in Norway that is a transformation of a former hospital site into an eco-friendly residential area in the inner city. Approximately 1,380 apartments, a transition from small-scale pilot studies to large-scale implementation of sustainable building in Norway with energy saving 50% lower than national average, water savings, reuse of materials, waste reduction, avoidance of harmful substance, building materials, improvement of local climate, high quality outdoor areas, good indoor air quality, reduction of noise, and finally focus on pedestrian, bicycle and public transport. The Western Harbour area in Malmö, where houses are built close together, the sustainable city has to use valuable ground space efficiently. A green space factor, which they have been inspired by Berlin, for example, ensures not only the inner courtyards are green with plenty of vegetation and ponds, green roofs and climbing plants on the walls are also part of the solution. A green space factor of minimum 0.5 was required when the areas was built, meaning that for every 100 square meter building area, there should be at least 50 square meter covered with vegetation. Furthermore, at least 10 green points out of 35 in total have been used in every courtyard, promoting, for example, bat nesting boxes, butterfly flower beds, wild flower meadows, country gardens, and enough soil depth for growing vegetables. The fourth, which is, as I see it, compared with the first one, the most important strategies, and that has to do with how to manage urban development. That is urban containment and integrated territorial policy approaches. Urban containment, or a clear spatial boundary between urban and rural land, and integrated spatial or territorial policies and strategies are the most important instruments regarding growth management for a sustainable development. A clear physical delineation between the urban and the rural does not mean that urban and rural development issues should be treated separately. On the contrary, what we need is a coordinated and integrated approach, including all relevant planning authorities. This is especially important in countries with many small independent municipalities and a weak regional level, as well as including stakeholders and their organizations. Strong planning legislation, that is the government part of this issue, and an open governance process are key factors in such an approach. Governance is this involving stakeholders and all these things, while the government part, the planning legislation and the authorities' power to steer development is the other dimension. And if you ask me what I think is most important, I'm absolutely in favor of the government aspect, a strong planning authorities. If you look at what's happening in real life and see the good examples of this. Yes, please.
These examples might work within societies that have a strong,
Yeah.
planning. But if you go to cities like Delhi or Cairo, it's just not, no planning is existing, and if it's existing, the corruption is just brilliant and everything. So how do you want to implement that? I mean, I can... Personally, I've been to Delhi, and
Yeah.
I cannot imagine that condos and butterflies are just in the middle of the city. It's just not possible to realize. How do you want to deal with these problems like megacities in third world countries?
I know I was opponent on a PhD study about what he called the Browning process in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, which is comparable. And he is stressing the same, that if you that it's important to have a bottom-up approach upon this. But I think at the same time, if you look at Dar es Salaam, as long as the Englishmen had control over it, then you had a very, from an environmental point of view, a very control over the situation. So I mean that. And I think it's important, actually. In this case, the strategy is is capacity building. You have to have a control over urban development. It's such a huge process, accelerating process, that if you slip the control, then you have, it's so difficult to go backwards again. And that's what we have to do, actually, in the developing countries. But of course you are right that you have these problems with corruption and things like that. So it's not done just like that. To have, and you also have, you can say that there has been, if we are talking about Europe, in Eastern Europe, there has been a long tradition of a very strong planning authorities, a completely top-down process. And then you get the backlash. Then you say that, I remember we were working with a project in St. Petersburg for quite a long time. And when we started to define the project, it was Danish environmental aid money put into it. So we were paying, so to say, for it. And they just wanted to get things done out in their to get projects, money for projects and things like that. And we said you have to have a strong planning strategy, and so and they said then you shouldn't talk with us about planning. We have experienced it so long. But now I think that you realize that this is extremely important, that you also need to have strategies, not only doing things that are anchored within the local society and local needs. The fifth strategy strategic issue I want to stress is the one about the urban-rural interface. The left picture is taken in the 19th century in Tampere in Finland. It shows a farmer who in the early morning has collected latrines in the city and now is returning to his farm in Karila, where he will spread its nutritious content in his field. That is a good example of the old days short circuits between. The farmers were not only produce food for the city, but they also took care of the waste. And the right picture is taken from a local market in Hangzhou in China. In the old days, as in developing countries today, there were short circuits in the flow of resources between towns and the surrounding countryside. In the future, if we should have a chance in the fight against climate change, we need an urbanism where recycling and short circuits are re-established in water and waste management, food and energy production, and supply with raw materials, etc. That was one example of the relationship between urban and rural areas. What other benefits can then peri-urban landscapes provide the cities with? Why is the surrounding landscape important for the city? Yes?
More directly kind of benefit from the existing services like fresh air, fresh water.
Yeah, you learn your lessons. Yes. And Hubert was also into this. I now will use the term ecosystem services. But okay, do you think of other things? Are there other than environmental qualities, so to say, you can think about? What? Recreation. Yes. Yes?
Strengthening the identity of the people within the region.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. I have listed here some ecosystem and quality of life services in the peri-urban landscape. And I think that is what Hubert meant when he said landscape use function is a combination of these. So biodiversity was mentioned, air quality, clean air, because forests and trees clean the air from particles and gaseous pollutants. Groundwater protection. Fresh water is something that you can transport water in bottles, but you can't transport water in pipelines for how long distances as you are depending on clean water near. Recreation, of course. Social inclusion, to have activities, for example, farms which take care of, you have a lot of this in the larger cities, areas with a lot of immigrants, problem areas, which are almost always in settlements or a residential area built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, low quality, such one which are on the fringe. Finally, health aspects combined with the recreation. We become more and more aware that the society today is facing poor health-related illnesses to the modern lifestyle, where, for example, stress-related illnesses, diabetes 2 and cardiovascular diseases where contact with nature and outdoor recreation are chances to ameliorate these illnesses. You can also put money on this. These are some figures primarily from Dutch. I don't have good figures on what diversity is. So this is actually what you calculate for the game value. It's 10 euros per kilo. But air quality, 80 to 320 euros per hectare of forested land is what they are expected to contribute. One, water protection, and so on. And now I come over to what Hubers was raising in this, and which I think is quite interesting, and that is, as I told you during the excursion, I own a piece of land in Småland in Sweden. And every year I get grants from EU, from Brussels, for keeping. Half of the grants are for, this is the first pillar for, you can say, production support. But the second half of the money is specified for keeping different qualities in the landscape. For example, keeping it open. So for pasture land, I get 110 to 250 euros per hectare. Open ditches, 6 euros per 100 meter. Stone walls, 25 euros per 100 meters. Solitary trees in the fields. And this is a landscape quite similar to what we visited by the last stop in the so-called third zone or third belt around Koper. And old buildings are also subsidized for keeping them. Yes, Frank?
Will you do this, or most people will do this without subsidies?
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure. But of course it helps. It's a way for society to say, okay, you are offering certain qualities. Sweden is a forested land as Slovenia, so we want to keep countryside open where it's possible. So it helps, absolutely. It's easy for me. I have a person who have horses there. They bought my parents' house and now they have horses, and the horses keep it open.
I'm asking this because there are some rumors that they will reduce budget in European Union to support agriculture.
Yes.
Which means that this will be a completely different picture in the future.
Yeah.
Because they will reduce from 46 to 42 or something like that. Then what will happen?
That is, of course, one scenario. That is a struggle today, you can say, between those who want to keep the subsidies, and especially Sweden is in favor of reducing them completely, to taking them away. And that is the scenario. The interesting scenario of the sensor project is that, okay, if you put them all away, what will happen then? You know, but this is the situation today. I mean, for me, it's this, you can say, services for the urbanized society that the hinterland or the peri-urban areas do for the benefits of the urban population. You could very well motivate, as well as these, you can say, cultural landscape values, which are kept to use money for that. Yes?
So I don't know what the situation in Sweden, but in Germany, there needs to be, like, if you want to settle somewhere, it needs to be allowed by the government somehow, so you can't just buy a field and build something on it. So why is the government not just doing it? Because, for example, the ditch is 6 euros per 100 meters. If I can build a house there and just, like, fill it up.
Yeah. Then it's, of course.
Why are they not just forbidding it? Like, in this area, just don't build houses and that's it.
Because in these cases you have to, these are things that, qualities that needs maintenance in a way. That is, you are paid for maintenance of the areas.
Otherwise it would happen like we saw yesterday, that the abandoned area starts overgrowing with bushes.
Yeah?
Now you keep clear.
Yeah. That is the main reason, you can say. That is the way of stopping overgrown.
Also going beyond of this, what I was asking, this also has something to do with this political competences. If you do have a pluralistic approach, you can't have a centralistic planning and also with these restrictions. This is not that easy doing because the competences are within these states or regional areas or whatever. And so you have to have a really very complicated and tricky system behind it, otherwise it will not work. This very often is the problem.
How much does it cost exactly to let that ditch in clean state? What's the transaction cost?
Take it once again, I didn't.
How much does it cost
To
inspect
keep-
all this?
Yeah, that is a good question, because that is what I have thought many times as well. It's the system costs a lot of money to keep running.
The technocrats.
Yeah.
It's the same situation with subsidies for agriculture.
Yeah.
Are blaming the European Union because we are subsidizing so much. But then again, I remember like how many inspectors were in from European Union to check if this money was this. And then figure out that we have to pay back almost 2 million euros because they found that the area was not exactly 200.5, but was 200.3 hectares. And that was really important because they use those wheels to measure the plot or the field. And if data was wrong, then they get money back. So inspection is huge part, not huge, but probably 10% of 20% of all money is going for inspection money now.
But do you think that it is totally crazy idea to think about this afforestation if there would not be this maintaining open space? Also from the point of view of food security, because if once you would have a forest instead of meadow, let's say, or even instead of urban land, you have to put a lot of energy to clean it back. Let's say first to cut trees, but you can use this for energy. But then to clean, let's say, all these roots and to give this back in agricultural production.
The background for the subsidies were at least and the protection of agricultural production in every nation were for security reasons. That was actually the background how it's done. And therefore every country protected their own production, so to say. But that is history now, as far as I see it. And it's true. The alternative here for me is simple. That is, you can say there are two alternatives. That is plantation in one way or the other, or afforestation. And you can choose between willows to produce energy or timber production. That
but in light of climate change, I think that there are already some articles on European level that because of climate change, we should think to have a little bit more agricultural land because the production it could not be so efficient. Let's say with all these natural disasters, with
Okay, that's a long discussion, and now I'm turning over to give a presentation a little about more what specifically the PLUREL project is dealing with, and then to place the Koper area and the Koper context. And so this is warming up actually for some ideas about the workshop tasks that you are supposed to deal with tomorrow and so on. So the project started, as I said, in the bus in 2007 and will go on until 2010. And it aims to achieve a deeper understanding of the changing relationships between urban and rural land use, to develop methods and tools to assess the environmental, social and economic impacts of land use change, to identify potential strategies and good practice examples to promote the sustainable development of land use systems in rural-urban regions. Some of the instruments here is to develop scenarios, to analyze and model the provision and need for natural resources, we use the case study regions actively to study governance and planning systems, to assess the impact and to enhance learning and cooperation between stakeholders and researchers. 31 parties started the project, representing 13 universities, 10 research institutes, and 8 small and medium-sized enterprises. And the project is coordinated by University of Copenhagen. SALF is one of 4 core partners, and University of Ljubljana and Marina is responsible for the case study part of the Koper area. So we are deeply the 3 of us here are deeply involved in it. 15 countries. There is a specific case study, a reference study in China, and the 7 letters of intent represent that we have authorities and local authorities as partners from each of these case studies. And as was said earlier, this discussion about what is happening on the overall pan-European scale and what is on the regional scale. We have these 2 levels quite strictly in the project. That one is looking at an overall picture of Europe, and a regional scale looking at the bottom up what is happening actually in real life and in real cooperation with regional stakeholders. A lot of classification job has been carried out to try to describe the regions. This is an example where the morphology of the region, where we have monocentric is a region where you have one big town or city, so to say, it's a central urban area, and then nothing else, so to say. And these are the most common, so these are divided into 3 different groups. Then we have regions which has a polycentric structure where you have several urban agglomerations in it, and then you have a more dispersed polycentric morphology, and finally also we have regions in Europe where you actually don't have any bigger urban agglomerations at all. You can see the same that I showed before, but on a more detailed scale where we separate between the development of the population in the urban area and in the rural area in the same regions. And we have, there you can see you have of course, most of them, the dots are representing the urban agglomeration, and the rest of the area is the rural population. And in most cases, there are a similar development, but you can also see some cases where you have, for example, increase in the urban area, and at the same time a strong decline in the rural areas. And finally, the proportion of people living in the different urban, peri-urban and rural zones. And then we are looking then, of course, from a European level to see how the impacts of urbanization, or how urbanization impacts on, for example, in this case, the landscape fragmentation. Which are the hotspots, which are the problem areas, to identify where in Europe do you have the largest commuter problems. Here you can see where do you have the most serious problems with landscape fragmentation in response to urbanization. And it looks like Spain, southern France and so on is the hotspot area according to this. That is a more overall view where we are producing a lot of maps showing Europe with regard to different response functions on urbanization process. In the case study regions, the other regions I have mentioned, beside Koper, it's Leipzig, Haaglanden in the Netherlands, Manchester, Greater Manchester in UK, Montpellier, France, Warsaw, and the reference Hangzhou in China. And the argumentation for using China is, of course, what you saw when I was showing the situation from a global point of view, where we really have the big urbanization development. For the case study areas, the futures are simulated. The development in the future are simulated, where we are starting with these 4 basic so-called shock scenarios, and then apply them to the local situation and combine them with a business as usual scenario. But in this case, we are not going systematically just repeating these 4 scenarios, but we are choosing what do the regional stakeholders think are the most interesting scenarios for their future, for their point of view, and combining them with different ways of stronger or weaker planning systems together with the stronger or weaker pressure from urban development. And the main instrument, there are 2 instruments how we are looking at predicting land use for the future. And one is, the main one is a so-called model called Moland. And this one means that we are using this overall data according to demographic development, economic development, and so on, but also including that is the zoning status, what is the planning regulation at the moment. So it's not only you can say a model showing what will happen if you don't regulate things, but you take into account both what is regulated today and what is in the plans for the future, the strategies of the local and regional authorities. What ideas do they have for their future development? More or less expressed. That differs, of course. In some cases, the finger plan in Copenhagen is a typical example then of a clear strategy, a vision, a visual vision of how to develop the areas. And I think that this was something that Hubert showed the same maps from the Leipzig area. So. And then, for example, in this case from Leipzig as well, we can see that how our different scenarios, in this case, the basic scenario, which is business as usual, compared with a hypertext scenario, which is a very strong economic development and also then consequently also urban development and its consequences for green spaces, for example. And another one is looking at what are the consequences for food production, food provision within the areas with different scenarios compared. Here you can see business as usual and hypertext during different years. And this is based on indicators, of course, and this spider web that was shown earlier, where, yeah. And what are you then supposed to do with this? This is supposed to be you. You should go into this material, which is especially, and it's important to, there is an excellent report on Koper and area and its problems. It's authored by Marina and her colleagues here in Ljubljana and the authorities in the Koper area. And you don't have time to establish, you can say, to draw new maps and things like that. But I think that we also during the excursion we discussed what are the challenges in this area. So you have now a visual picture as well, but and you should use the evening tonight to really, if you haven't read the full report on the Koper area, which is in your reference material, you should do that. And I formulated 3 questions in the bus in the beginning, and I want to add one, which I mean that thanks to Hubert, who stressed this one about biodiversity or nature production as well. But the first one, what I think that we should do is to present something which is a help, ideas for a sustainable land use strategy for the development of the Koper region. And the target for this strategy, or for your advice, is the municipality of Koper, the local or the regional authorities here, to help them, to give them ideas. How do you think, how to manage the future urban development in these 3 belts, and how to manage this peri-urban zone, so to say, and ideas on that. The second issue is about the potential conflict between the development of the port of Koper and the municipalities, there's an I too much into it, ambitions regarding tourism. And then, a little provocatively, does agriculture have a future in an area like this? And if so, what are the functions, what are the strategies to develop agriculture or preserving it in a region like this? And finally, the potentials for biodiversity production. This was, you saw, we saw a completely man-made nature reserve in the outskirts of the city of Koper, or the town of Koper. And we also have this discussion about subsidies or agriculture producing values. I mean, it was also a discussion about biodiversity, nature quality and things like that. I mean that these meadows and a lot of these open areas, the natural quality in them is in many cases much higher than most natural vegetation societies and things like that that will develop if you don't do anything. There are a lot of nature qualities with it which are depending on a certain maintenance in one way or the other.